Good morning, Dr. Wallis.
Good morning, Sir Brian.
Now, you're talking, or will be talking, to a small and select group here in the Aldwych, but a much larger group online who will be watching you remotely.
Okay.
Mary will ask you to take the oath, and then Ms. Fraser-Butlin will ask you the questions.
Please state your full name.
Jonathan Peter Wallis.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Dr. Wallis. Could we start by just providing an overview of your career? So you qualified in August 1979,
I did.
and you then underwent training posts specifically in haematology from 1984,
Yes.
and you became a consultant haematologist at the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle in 1990,
That's correct.
and remained there until 2019 when you retired.
I did, yes.
If we can start from the time when you were in training, when you completed your training, what were you taught about the risks of blood transfusion?
None of my screens are working.
We spent 6 months of our training at the Regional Transfusion Centre, where we looked at many aspects of blood transfusion. We were very concerned at that time about the risks of HIV in particular. Hepatitis B, we felt, I think, had largely been sorted out, but HIV was still new, and in particular in the early or later 80s, 87, 88, although the tests were available and donor exclusion had made a big difference, we were particularly worried about the window period that might lead to infections getting in through blood transfusion.
Can you go back even further in time before we even get to your haematology training?
Yeah.
Apologies, I should have made that clear. When you were even at medical school and in your very first training jobs before your haematology-specific training jobs, what were you taught then?
I have a very limited recollection of that, I have to say. But what I do have probably relates to the worries about ABO incompatibility, and that was the thing we were mostly focused on, was preventing ABO incompatibility, which could lead to dramatic reactions and early death.
And then still in that pre-1984 stage, when did you first become aware of the risk of AIDS from transfusion?
I think it was probably, I may have got this date wrong, but when I was finishing as a haematology registrar at Exeter, probably about 1985, 84, 85, where the AIDS epidemic was first flagged up, and it immediately became evident that blood transfusion was one route by which it could be transmitted.
We've talked in the inquiry about a particular case in San Francisco involving a young child contracting AIDS and the only route being transfusion. Did that situation cross your radar at the time?
No, it did not.
So your knowledge was somewhat later?
Yes.
And in terms of your understanding of non-A, non-B hepatitis, what was your understanding of that as you were doing that early pre-haematology specific training, or just into the beginning of that?
I think I was pretty much unaware of that at that time. I don't think I had any knowledge that I recall.
When do you think you first became aware of non-A, non-B?
I think during my haematology training when I was at Newcastle, where there was a lot of concern about post-transfusion transaminitis, that is, rising of liver enzymes, and what this meant. And at the time, of course, it was not hepatitis C, but non-A, non-B. And there was quite a lot of discussion about that and what could be done about it.
And so just in terms of dates, when you went up to Newcastle for your training, that would be
1986.
1986, thank you. You've said in your statement that your view was that the risks posed by transfusion at that time were small and that donor exclusion was very effective at reducing transfusion risk. How did you come to that view?
I think that view postdates the actual time that we've been discussing, and there was some good evidence from the west coast of America that donor exclusion had a dramatic effect on the rates of transmission via blood, and that the testing added to that, but donor exclusion was the key.
And once you became a consultant and had a junior team under you, so from about 1990, what did you tell your juniors, your registrars and what was then I think called senior health officers, about the risks of blood transfusion?
I think we focused on more of the immediate risks, and we were concerned about viral transmission, and as I said, we were concerned about the window period, but a lot of the risks that we appreciated were the more immediate ones. So again, it goes back to ABO incompatibility and other problems. We were particularly concerned as to whether the storage age of the blood had an effect on its efficacy or even its adverse effects, and there was a lot of work done in that area. So we were concerned more about general aspects of where blood could possibly be harmful. I'm pleased to say that after a lot of research, there is very little evidence that a longer storage period does have any effect, but that's one of the key things we were worried about at the time.
And that was the key message you were giving to your juniors?
I wouldn't say that
initially
was a key message, it was one of the messages, yes.
Did that change over the 29 years, I think it was, of your career as a consultant? Let me rephrase that. In terms of how much emphasis was placed on the risks of infection and the messages to your juniors?
I think we became very concerned about variant CJD in the late 90s, and I used to give talks to the juniors specifically about that and what the risks were, that was a concern. We were fortunate, I think, that we didn't get more of a problem, but that was probably one of the major longer-term side effects that we discussed. But otherwise, we discussed the short-term, the immediate problems, which could lead to early mortality, and those perhaps occupied more of the time.
I want to come back to the specific clinical work that you did, but before we go there, I'd like to discuss with you some of the organisational and structural things that were in place. You were a member of something called the Zonal Blood User Group from 1995 to 1999. First of all, could you explain for us what that group was and what it sought to achieve?
Yes, when the transfusion service was changed from being purely regional with a sort of overview from a national transfusion organisation to being nationally based, it was decided there needed to be some form of feedback to help the clinicians at the coalface feedback their information to the much larger groups, and the Zonal Blood Group was part of that. There were 3 zones, and the northern zone was the one I was part of. They didn't last that long because before long the zones were disbanded and we went to a completely national blood service, which you probably are fully aware of.
And in terms of the Zonal Blood User Group, you've said it was partly to pass on concerns and have a way of managing information.
Yeah.
Did it have an educational role at all in terms of risks?
I don't recall that. I haven't thought about the zonal blood groups particularly very deeply, but I don't recall it having a particularly educational role as it was set up.
You were also then a member of the National Blood Transfusion Committee from 2001 to 2005, and then again about from 2010 to 2015, 2014, becoming the chair 2015 to 2019.
That's correct.
And you were the president of the British Blood Transfusion Society 2015 to 2017.
I was.
On Monday, the inquiry had a presentation on the various guidelines that were produced, both generally and for specific specialities. Starting with a general view of the position, if a guideline was produced by the relevant committee of the British Society of Haematology, how would a haematology clinician expect to become aware of it?
They were published usually in the British Journal of Haematology, which all haematologists would read. They were sometimes published in the Journal of Transfusion Medicine if they were very laboratory-based. That was only some haematologists would read that. We would often discuss them at our regional meetings. I can't speak for all guidelines, and we tended to select the guidelines which were relevant to our area. So somebody working in acute leukemia specifically might not take as much notice of a laboratory transfusion guideline as perhaps I would. So it did vary. We picked those that we were interested in. There wasn't a way of parachuting it into everyone. But there were many haematology meetings at which they would be brought up, and I was aware that my regional colleagues, in particular at the district hospitals in the region, were pretty good on picking up at guidelines that were published.
And just thinking about those colleagues in district hospitals rather than the main teaching hospital that you found yourself in,
Yes.
would they rely on you in the teaching hospitals to alert them to it?
No.
It would be through the journals?
It would be.
The inquiries had evidence of regional transfusion committees as well, so the national committee,
Yes.
the regional committees, and then the hospital committees. What role did the regional transfusion committees have in disseminating those guidelines?
I think we would usually discuss those that were specifically about transfusion. I would have to look at the minutes to see how deep we went. There were many committee meetings, and I'm afraid I can't recall all the details of all of them. They all become a bit of a muddle after a few years. But I think we would highlight that there was a new guideline, and we would often then suggest that some audit was done to see how we adhered to that guideline. Obviously, a new guideline came out that some places would need to make changes to adhere to it, so you wouldn't want to do that straight away unless you wanted to see how far away you were from it.
And who would be present on those regional transfusion committees, generally?
When it started, we had a very good representation from consultant haematologists and from laboratory managers, blood transfusion laboratory managers throughout the region. After about 5 or 6 years, the consultant haematologists tend to drop off. It has to be said that the workload of district consultant haematologists was getting more and more onerous during that time, and they had to prioritise their time. So I would say that we would get haematologists, consultant haematologists, from about 1/3 of the district hospitals in the area. As the trusts developed, amalgamating quite a lot of hospitals, we usually had representation from most of the trusts at that level. But we had laboratory managers usually from most large trusts, or all large trusts I would say, and we also increasingly had representation from clinical nurse specialists, or transfusion nurses as they were known in the region, and they were very good at taking information to and fro.
And so something might be discussed, a guideline might be flagged in the regional transfusion committee, and then there would be a reliance on the transfusion practitioner, the nurse, or the laboratory manager if the clinician wasn't present.
Yes, it would be, I think, expected that the guideline would have been noted already by the haematology service in the hospitals and not wait for the regional transfusion committee. They were only every, I think, 3 months, I think. And so we would expect them to have noted it before. It was more discussion about it, not that we were the one that was going to draw it to their attention. The laboratories, the laboratory managers of blood transfusion laboratories usually were pretty good on picking up on the more laboratory-based guidelines.
And in terms of the role of the regional transfusion committee getting guidance out to other specialties outside of haematology, Was there any role played by the Regional Transfusion Committee in doing that?
Yes, in an indirect way. We held one or two, usually one educational meeting each year that focused on a particular area, say obstetrics or perinatal medicine. And if there were guidelines that were relevant to that, they would almost undoubtedly be discussed somewhere within that meeting. It wouldn't be seen as a place where the guideline was brought up afresh, but it would likely be discussed. I think the guidelines were promulgated more through the hospital transfusion committees to other specialities because that was in more real time. So it's all very well having a meeting on obstetrics 1 year, and if it's 10 years before you get around to obstetrics again, you would have missed a few guidelines. So it wasn't a prime way of getting it out, no.
And so then moving on to those hospital transfusion committees, you've said that you think that the hospital transfusion committee at the Freeman Hospital started in about 1977.
I think my predecessor in my job, Dr. Cresci, was very good at setting it up, and I was fortunate to inherit the work he'd already done. I could have been less fortunate, but he had set up a very good system with him chairing the Hospital Transfusion Committee, and I took over chairing that Hospital Transfusion Committee very soon after I was appointed. One of the problems we had was getting attendance from other specialities. So because of that, I gave up being the chair and made an anaesthetist the chair, and that was far more effective because you guaranteed at least one anaesthetist would be present, but they would also draw in their colleagues, and it became much more useful with that change.
So which specialities tended to be represented,
well,
if they attended, for the Hospital Transfusion Committee?
We would generally get a surgeon, possibly two surgeons, one from, say, cardiothoracic, because we had a big cardiothoracic surgical unit. We would generally get an obstetric anaesthetist once we had joined up with the Royal Victoria Infirmary, which did all the obstetrics. We would usually a vascular surgeon. Medical personnel, physicians and geriatricians were less good at attending, I have to say. But many of the major blood users were present. Attendance varied, of course.
And what were the responsibilities and the aims of that Hospital Transfusion Committee? What was its role?
Well, I think I've set it out in my statement. We would generally have a section looking at any adverse reactions that have been reported since the previous committee, so any possible infections, any other immunological problems, especially where there had been perhaps somebody had transfused blood to the wrong person. I'm glad to say that didn't happen very often at all, but that sort of issue. We were very hot on sampling, so getting samples from the right patient should be easy, but surprisingly sometimes difficult. So if we had errors where a sample arrived and we knew it was not from the patient that it was labelled as being from, we collated all those and would bring those up. So part of the meeting was to look at all errors, mistakes, reactions that occurred. We would look at any new developments, such as new guidelines that we felt needed to be followed and whether we needed to change our practice. We discussed things like cell salvage fairly intensively, autologous blood transfusion and the like. We had representation from the Regional Transfusion Centre, which was very valuable, and they usually turned up every meeting. I can't remember everything we discussed, but they were fairly wide-ranging.
And what was the particular input from the Regional Transfusion Centre attendee?
Well, if there were new developments, let's say a component's formulation was being changed or something like that, they would tell us. If there were changes in how the centre was being set up, for instance, at one stage they were going to move some of the laboratories away to Leeds, then they would mention that and we'd discuss that. if they were particularly concerned about some aspect of transfusion safety, they would bring that up. They were also there to receive questions and comments about their service. So it was a two-way process.
And did they take any role in the Transfusion Committee in relation to what later became known as better blood transfusion, of encouraging reduced usage of blood, or?
I think that came from us as much as anything. I'm not saying they didn't help with that, but I think the impetus came from within the staff of the hospital.
And the haematology staff particularly, or did it come from other clinical areas as well?
I think the haematology staff, the anaesthetists were very helpful indeed, and some of them initially were uncertain, but they were very valuable in moving things forward. Some of the older surgeons, not surprisingly, were more fixed in their ways, and we all become fixed in our ways as we get older, and were more difficult to persuade to change their practice, and that's where the anaesthetists really came in, because they were the ones who were working with them and often the ones actually giving the blood.
Just before we finish this sort of organisational aspect, we heard evidence yesterday from an obstetrician and an obstetric anaesthetist, and we looked at some of the guidelines from the British Society of Haematology, which in their hospitals they'd not come across and hadn't been aware of. Was there any mechanism within the Freeman Hospital of making sure that an obstetrician had seen the British Society of Haematology guidance on a particular issue, or an anaesthetist had seen a particular guidance, because it was coming from the British Society of Haematology rather than from their own area?
No, I don't think there was a formal mechanism, but we did hold individual meetings with various specialities at various times where we would discuss these things. And again, the obstetric anaesthetists in particular would come to the hospital transfusion committee, and it was felt it was their responsibility to take back anything like that to their colleagues, which I believe they did. We did have a central database of guidelines which became computerized, I can't tell you when, probably about 2010, 2012, so that anyone could look up guidelines for anything. That was valuable. But they were available before then. There was a central register of guidelines, and it went before a different committee, I cannot remember its name, something like Patient Safety Committee, so they would get guidelines. In fact, perhaps correct that previous statement, that committee, whatever it was called, used to flag up guidelines to me sometimes. They would say, oh, there's a new guideline out on so-and-so, are you aware of it? One of the questions was, how much will it cost to put this into place? So there was a group specifically with some of that remit. I'm afraid you're dredging into the memory banks here, but when that was set up, I'm not sure, probably about 2002, 2003, I think.
And the committee which was concerned about the cost of matters, was that formerly called a safety committee?
Cannot remember the exact name, Sir Brian. When I say the cost, the trust has to balance its books. And if a new guideline came that said you should do something that was clearly going to be very expensive, they wanted to know how much it would cost. And if you said it's going to cost this much, they would then say to the trust management, we need more money for this. It wasn't punitive, it was trying to assess where the cost pressures were going to come. So it wasn't to decide whether or not to ignore the guideline, it was decide how to fund it, if it were expensive.
Yes, so the process would be, we need this for safety, we now need to fund it, so how much does it cost?
Yes, that's right. They would ask me.
I see.
It particularly occurred with various chemotherapy regimes, that's nothing to do with transfusion, various chemotherapy regimes for the malignant diseases I treated. They would say the new guideline says we should do this and this, what's it going to cost? And it could easily be an extra £50,000 per patient, something like that. we needed to know that, so the pharmacy bill, if necessary, could be increased to match that.
And the argument on the other side, what does it cost not to do it? Was that part of the, who would reach that balance?
I think where there was a specific guideline, there was not often a suggestion that we shouldn't do it. It was more how we're going to do it.
I see.
I don't say that it never occurred, but I don't recall it. Very different if the initiative came from me and I said, I think we should do this. It's not in the guideline, but I think we should do this for either benefit of the patients or safety or whatever, then we would have prolonged arguments.
So your route, if it came from you, was to get it through the committee and into a guideline, was it?
No, because guidelines were often 5 years in the making. That was not something that would be effective. You might use the guideline to say, look, this guideline says we should strive to do this, and I can do it in this way. But no, the route was not to try and get it into a guideline.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'd like to move on then to some of the more the clinical side of your work, and you've described in your statement that your role had 3 aspects to it: the laboratory work or the blood bank work, indirect clinical care and direct clinical care. If we can start then with the laboratory work, what we've been calling blood bank work.
Yes.
In terms of the process of blood being provided to a patient, is it right that broadly a form was sent to the laboratory, and then once the cross-matching was completed, the blood would then be provided? It's a very simplistic set of the process.
Yes, that changed quite a lot over the 30 years. So the form would come to the laboratory with a sample. We would then test the sample, and if they wanted the blood, immediately provide it. But we used those samples for some long period then to provide blood later on if required. So the form was usually just a request for what was called group and save. So we grouped the blood and saved the sample. In fact, we didn't save the sample subsequently. It should have been just called group because we changed our practice. And then having got that data, then we would provide blood on demand. That was quite an important change in the 90s that provided more rapid provision of blood when it was needed without a lot more administrative problems.
And in terms of record keeping, in the early 90s, what records were kept by the blood bank about the blood that had been supplied?
We introduced computerized blood banking sometime in the early 80s, and that was there. We changed the computer sometime in the 90s, and we also amalgamated with 2 other hospitals with different blood bank computer systems. The very earliest records were on paper, and many of the records from the other hospitals were on paper up to about, I think, 1985, something like that. And they were stored. The records from the Freeman Hospital go back to, I think, 1977. I would have to be checked to be absolutely sure, but I think we kept them permanently. The computer records remain permanent and are backed up regularly to make sure that there can be no loss due to fire or flood, something like that.
And in fact, some of the paper records from the Freeman were lost in a basement flood at the document storage unit.
There was an extreme flood that flooded large bits of Newcastle. It was a dramatic day, and the storage unit where many hospital documents were stored unfortunately had a basement which flooded, and we lost quite a few records from the laboratory there, but included some transfusion records.
And in terms of what was on those records, was there any record in the 80s and early 90s of the ultimate use of the blood? So which patient it had gone to?
Yes,
or even
every
which ward? So what was available on the blood bank records in terms of the recipient?
We would have known, certainly at Freeman Hospital, where every unit had gone from the early 80s, probably. I would have to double check that date with somebody from the blood bank. But when computerization was introduced, we did not lose any records subsequently that I'm aware of. We issued blood for a patient. If it were by some mischance given to another patient, we wouldn't have known that unless that error had then been detected. But we issued blood for that patient. If the patient was transferred to another hospital, occasionally blood would be sent with the patient if they were very ill, and we would then not be certain whether that blood had been transfused or not within our own record. And the Regional Transfusion Committee actually spent quite a long time discussing that problem. So I would say at Freeman Hospital, the records were very good. The records at the Newcastle General Hospital, one of the hospitals we merged with, went back a lot further and were less complete as a result of that. Computerization had been introduced rather later there, I think. But they were probably good from the mid-80s, certainly I would say from the 90s.
Including the connection from the blood bank to the recipient?
Yes, we cross-matched a unit of blood or labelled a unit of blood as for use for person X. If that blood was not returned to us, it was assumed to be transfused to person X. There were occasions, of course, where somebody comes in with, say, massive trauma and a lot of blood is sent out in a great hurry, and because of the nature of the situation, the documentation may be less than perfect. We cannot be certain that blood that we sent out wasn't simply disposed of on site without being transfused, but we assumed it had been transfused if it didn't come back to us.
And in terms of blood coming back to you, how were returns logged?
Oh, we would then mark it that that unit had not been transfused, so it would be marked as cross-matched for that patient but unused.
And would it then go back into the blood bank?
It would if it were not outside its storage date or hadn't been kept out of temperature control on the wards beyond a certain period.
You've talked about the merger within Newcastle of a number of different hospitals, and that the Newcastle General perhaps had fewer records until they got to computerisation, which was a bit later.
I'd say the records were more difficult. I remember from look-backs where we had to search for older records that finding some of the records in the other hospitals was more difficult than ours. We were fortunate that we had a new hospital with, as I say, I was fortunate to inherit a very well-designed transfusion system with early computerization, so everything was in my favour for that. Whereas the older hospitals, where I also worked as a trainee, were very different. So it is not surprising that some of the earlier records were more difficult to find.
And when you were undertaking those look-back processes, particularly in the other where the other hospitals were involved, what difficulties did you tend to find in the records?
A lot of the problem was we were given a donation number, and on a computer you can search by many fields. We could search by donation number, but on a paper record you can't do that, and the donation numbers would be scattered. So if you had 3 or 4 books of the transfusion records from the laboratory, you would have to search over quite a long period, and that could take a long time, and sometimes we could not find a unit. Then we didn't know whether we'd missed it, whether it had not been recorded, or whether for some reason it had not been transfused but disposed of. And I can't be sure, and again I would have to ask some of my older colleagues whether at those hospitals when a unit wasn't transfused, whether it was registered in the blood bank logbooks or not.
But in terms of finding that donation, that donation number, you were literally going through the book trying to find the number.
That's right, yes.
And presumably it was all handwritten numbers.
It was, yes, yes.
Could we turn to NHBT 0111 389_001, please. It should appear on the screen just in front of you. This is a British Society for Haematology report on guidelines on hospital blood bank documentation and procedures from 1984. And if we can turn, please, to page 3. I'm just going to read some of it, Dr. Wallis, and then I'll ask you about it. It starts in this way, that the document's been prepared by the Blood Group and Transfusion Task Force under the auspices of the British Committee for Standards. Its purpose is to define minimum requirements for documentation in relation to blood transfusion, and we see 3 principles under this paragraph. The patient identification must be unique. There must be a clear link between each stage in the procedure, from the collection of the sample to the connection of the unit for transfusion. And thirdly, that it's possible to trace every stage, the time at which it occurred, and the individuals who were involved. And then if we go on to page 8, this is a section that's headed on the previous page, ward procedure. So it's ward-based, and it says in the middle, as stated above, each unit of blood transfused should be recorded in the patient's notes on a special intravenous administration form. And then at the bottom of the indented part, it says this document should form a permanent part of the patient record. In terms of the recording on patient records at ward level, what degree of oversight did a haematologist have on what happened on the wards in terms of record keeping?
There was a clinical records committee, and I don't think a haematologist was a necessary member of that committee, but I think one of the laboratory consultants from all the other laboratory disciplines would have been. I know my colleague, Dr. Kestevan, who I worked with for many years, chaired that committee for some time, and it was their job to look at records, how they're being kept, and whether any changes should be undertaken. We did not take personal responsibility for how things were done in an individual ward, which was not under our control, not a haematology ward. We did, however, decide in the 90s that the system was flawed, and we changed it. So we went from having a form which went onto a A4 sheet with lots of little pull-off sticky sellotape things, which you stuck the label on, and they lasted about 2 or 3 years. And I remember writing to the chief executive complaining that the new sheets we had deficient stickiness, and that all the forms were falling off. So that would have then gone back to the clinical records committee. We decided that was not good, so we changed the way we recorded in the notes.
And just before we talk about the change, in terms of the sticky labels, we heard some evidence of this yesterday from the obstetrician. Could you just explain what somebody on the ward was expected to do?
Yes, they would receive a unit of blood, and with a form with it, with an elastic band round the form and the unit of blood to hold it together. They would then take that form, which would have the unit numbers that have been prepared for the patient. They would then look at the prescription, which had been done by the medical officer, and they would write the unit number that they were putting up onto the patient's drip against the prescription. So it was recorded on the fluid balance sheet where the prescription was given. They would then mark on the form, they would sign 2 signatures from 2 medical people, nurses usually, to say that they had checked that unit against the form and against the patient, and that would then go in the notes, in the records eventually. Now, if there were multiple units to be transfused, which was commonly the case, that would probably be done at the end of the transfusion. So you then get the form perhaps with 4 donor numbers on. You would have 8 signatures, 2 against each, and that would then go in the notes. So it was recorded in 2 ways, both on the fluid balance sheet where the number was written and on this form that was sent out by the transfusion department.
Was there anything else? The obstetrician yesterday indicated that in his hospital he had a sticky label that he had to undo and then stick in as well.
Yeah, I think that in the mid-90s we decided that this just was not a secure system. And so we changed to a system by which we call the tag and label system, which we introduced in Newcastle. There were some other hospitals with similar sorts of systems. And in that we had a label attached to the bag by a little plastic widget. And when it got to the ward, they would peel off part of that label and put it in the notes. There was a lot of argument about where it should go in the notes, and we argued strongly, and it was agreed in the end, that it would go in the continuation notes. That's where all the medical dealings are written. And the reason we did that was because those were rarely lost. And because of the nature of the label, it being about 2.5 inches by 1.5 inches, it had far more sticky on it, to use a technical term, and was unlikely to come off. In fact, I don't ever recall them coming off. And that, I believe, proved fairly effective.
But that's quite a significant change in terms of somebody going back to their notes, isn't it? Because previously they would be looking for the fluid balance chart.
That would still be there. The fluid balance chart with the prescription would still be there. This wasn't a prescription. This was a record of the unit that had been put up as a result of that prescription. And then it fitted with the date, so you could see very clearly where it fitted in the patient's care. So there'd be an entry saying 11 o'clock, patient needs blood transfusion, and then a sticky, so you knew precisely when it occurred. But there would be a fluid balance chart with prescription as a separate item, and subsequently that became electronic.
But your view of why the sticky should go in the continuation notes was because they were much less likely to be lost.
It was partly that. It was partly for visibility. It made it much easier to see. Instead of scrabbling around in the back of the notes with perhaps 100 pieces of paper on a patient who'd been in the hospital a long time, trying to find out how many units have been transfused. I don't know. Look in the back of the notes and bits of paper would fly all over the place. This way you just open the notes at your current entry and you could count them straight away. So it was easier.
And if we can just turn to a journal paper that you produced on the tag and label system, yes. RLIT 301 at 3 zeros, please. We see you're one of the authors, and it's published in 2003. Guidelines for checking and recording of blood transfusion guidelines for checking and recording of blood transfusion mandate the use of a blood transfusion compatibility form. We've introduced and assessed a tag and label system that does away with the compatibility form. A compatibility tag with a peel-off self-adhesive label is attached to the unit for transfusion. No compatibility form is issued to the site of the transfusion. The peel-off label is signed and fixed in patient notes at the time of the transfusion. We found the system easier to use and to be preferred by nursing staff administering transfusions. During 2 years, we've transfused over 100,000 blood components, including 70,000 units of red cells, and have not recognised any episode during which the wrong blood was transfused to a patient. Recording in the patient notes of units transfused has significantly improved compared with local and national figures in a previous survey. So is it also right that, in order to do this article, that there had been some work on whether recording was significantly improved?
It would seem so, yes. Perhaps I should say that an important part of this was that the checking of the blood against the patient is vital to make sure you give the right blood to the right patient, and not the blood to Mrs. Snooks, to Mrs. Smith in the bed next door to her. And the nurses are asked to check that, or the doctor's doing it, whether it's doctor or nurse asked to check that. We did away with the compatibility form because it was common practice, and been observed both in our hospital but in many other places, to see people checking the blood against this form, usually at the nursing station, and then thinking they'd done the check. They'd done a check that was correct, and then they'd go to the patient because they were quite certain who the patient was, and they failed to do the check between the blood and the patient. So one of the important aspects of this change was actually to get rid of a compatibility form to make it impossible for them to check the blood at the bedside, at the nursing station or elsewhere. They had to go to the patient to check it against their wristband, and that was the major change in many ways, was getting rid of the compatibility form.
With a side benefit, as it were, of much improved recording of the fact and number of the transfusion.
That's what we believed, yes.
In terms of process within the hospital, what processes were in place for adverse reactions or transfusion-transmitted infections to be reported to the haematology team?
We had a specific form which was kept on all wards, and if there was any transfusion reaction, the first thing people on the ward would do would be ring the blood bank. They'd usually speak to a member of the scientific staff who would, if it were a very minor thing that was easy to deal with it, but generally would pass it on to one of the haematology medical staff, myself or a registrar, for them to ask about. Again, depending on the nature of the reaction, whether it was real or not, they would be asked to fill in the form that was on the ward, and they would come down to us. We would undertake the necessary investigations or whatever it was, depending on the nature of the reaction. That might be extremely urgent, or it might be something we'd do the next day.
And particularly prior to the introduction of hepatitis C screening of blood, was there any requirement for clinicians to notify you of a patient who developed hepatitis?
No, there was no requirement as such, not that I'm aware of. You'll realise, of course, that I came into post and developed an interest in transfusion just as we were introducing screening. So once again, Lady Fortune smiled on me. But I don't believe there was any requirement prior to that time. However, if a patient developed jaundice following a transfusion, we would expect the clinicians to call us and speak to us. They would often first go to the microbiologist who dealt with virology as well in our hospital, and they would come to us. We usually had coffee together. It didn't take much before the information got through to us. So there was a clear route by which this would occur, but it was the responsibility of the physician or the surgeon looking after the patient to make that notification. It is possible that if that jaundice occurred a sufficient distance from the transfusion, that it was not appreciated that it might be related to it. And there would be other cases where the jaundice was due to many other things. So I think the information would usually get to us, but there was no formal mechanism for that particular problem occurring.
And in relation to your years as a registrar as well, which would have been 1984 to 1990,
Yes.
were you aware of any formal mechanism being used?
I don't recall them, no. It doesn't say there weren't, but I don't recall them.
Once a patient had been discharged, are you aware of any mechanism, formal or otherwise, for any information to come back to the haematologists about jaundice or hepatitis?
No. Once again, it was then responsibility, if the patient went to the general practitioner with jaundice, they might do the appropriate tests. The question then, as I'm sure you're aware, is whether the GP recognised that that patient had had a recent transfusion, because it might be in the discharge notes or it might not be. It would be then up to someone to make the link.
And do you recall in your registrar years, particularly in the very beginning of being a consultant, ever having a report from a GP of post-transfusion hepatitis?
I don't recall that, no. I don't say it didn't occur, but I don't recall it.
You've said in your statement that from the late 1990s, the hospital introduced a new grade of staff, transfusion nurses.
Yes.
And one of their roles was to follow up and investigate any reports of adverse reactions or infections. Why was that new grade of staff introduced? What was it seeking to do?
Initially, we introduced a non-nursing role, somebody known as a transfusion audit clerk, and it was because we wanted to audit transfusion. And in about 95 or 96, we introduced a clerk basically to collate data so that we could feed it back to clinicians on how much blood they were using. We realized after a bit that although we were getting the data back, it was perhaps falling into a bit of a black hole. And we found that by employing a qualified nurse who would go on to the wards, we got far more penetration, so to speak, into the system, and it made quite a lot of difference.
And so they were both auditing blood usage and, from your statement, looking at adverse reactions and...
They had several roles there. I think in the job description, we defined it as being a third research, a third auditing blood use, and a third following up of reactions. Subsequently, there was another role which developed very strongly, which is training of nurses and medical staff on the ward, so they became very active in training of other staff in the whys and wherefores of blood transfusion.
And the decision to introduce this new grade in the sort of the clerk in the mid-90s, the nurses in the late 90s, was it your sense that that was broadly the picture nationally, or was Newcastle one of the few places making that change?
I think we were an early adopter of this. I think we may have had the first specific person named as such, but there were others who were looking at it at the same time.
And was there any reason why that grade of staff doing the important things you're talking about, could that have been introduced at an earlier point in time?
Yes, it could have been.
Why wasn't it?
I think the requirement for audit developed strongly in the 90s with the also development of clinical governance, and that we became more aware of the need to monitor what we were doing. Medicine changed from being top-down to more of a team sport. And I think with that, we realized that we needed help. And it's not something as a consultant hematologist with a malignant patient workload that you can do yourself. We didn't have enough staff in the blood bank to do it. So we felt we needed extra help. I think it came from that general change in the way medicine was managed.
And so would it be fair to say that the changes in transfusion medicine towards audit was a change that was occurring across medicine more generally?
Yes, I think it would be fair to say that.
I want to move on then to explore the issue of indirect clinical care. Firstly, can you explain how you'd come to interact with other clinicians, non-haematologists, about the need for a transfusion for a particular patient? Very practically, how would you end up involved?
I would only be involved if there was a problem. So it was up to them to transfuse, and I would not wish to be involved in decisions about every patient. We had a large cardiothoracic surgery unit. We also had a liver transplant unit. We had quite a few surgical specialities that used a lot of blood, and it's not surprising that occasionally they'd run into serious trouble with bleeding. We had the laboratory to do all the coagulation tests and provide the blood products, and they would ring us up to ask for advice. I've got a patient on the table and he's bleeding to death. What can I do? And apart from asking him to get the surgeon to get busy, which was obvious, we would look at the coagulation tests and say, well, I think you need to give this product or that product, and we'll make sure it's available. That's on a simplistic level, but that's roughly what we were doing.
So in terms of the day-to-day decision to use transfusion, a haematologist wouldn't be involved in a particular patient?
Only with our own patients, yes.
What was your understanding as to how transfusions were regarded by your colleagues in other departments?
In other departments, I think that's a difficult one to answer. I think there would be a wide range of opinions. So we had some colleagues who were transfusion averse and other colleagues who were not averse to transfusion. I think most of them, like me, felt that it was largely safe, and we are talking after the introduction of hepatitis C testing. Beforehand, I can discuss perhaps, but I think they felt it was largely safe. Probably thought it was safer than I thought it was.
So taking that time frame, and we will come back to the earlier time frame, post hepatitis C testing, was there a difference that you could discern between different specialities and their view of blood transfusion, or was it very person specific?
There was some difference between specialities. A lot of it was probably person specific. If we take, say, orthopedics, some of the younger surgeons were very good at avoiding use of blood, whereas some of the older ones were in the habit of transfusing fairly freely. So I think there was a lot of individual variation between people within a single department. In cardiothoracic surgery, I think there was a general understanding that they preferred not to use so much blood. We used to feed back figures to them on a regular basis, and surgeons are competitive animals and would take, if they had excessive blood use compared to a colleague, would be worried about that. That was probably one of the most effective things you could do if you wanted to reduce blood use. So I think more variation between persons than between departments.
And you spoke in your statement of undertaking regular audits of transfusion practice in the cardiothoracic surgical unit. Yes. In the late 90s. Yeah. Why were those audits introduced? What was the trigger for them?
The blood use there was very considerable. There was concern about adverse effects of blood, not viral infection, but as I mentioned, whether blood itself was bad and whether blood that had been stored for a long time increased the risk of infection. And we did a study on that. So there was a general feeling that we shouldn't be giving blood unless there was good reason to do so. It's very difficult to know how you change your practice if you don't know what you're doing. So counting or auditing, measuring what you're doing was a critical first step.
And when those audits were set up, was that something that the cardiothoracic team asked you to do, or was it initiated from the haematologist?
I think it was initiated from haematology, but they were very helpful and went along with it, the anaesthetists in particular.
And then if you can go back in your mind to before hepatitis C screening, do you have anything you can assist us with in terms of the attitudes towards blood transfusion of your colleagues in other specialities?
No, I don't think I can. I know there was some research before I went to Freeman Hospital as a consultant in looking at post-transfusion jaundice or post-operative jaundice in the cardiothoracic unit. So they were thinking about it, but I'm afraid I cannot give you any details about that.
You've, sorry, just to tie off one final point, you've indicated that it was the responsibility of the clinician whose patient it was to decide whether to transfuse. Whose responsibility was it then to record that transfusion in the patient records and to inform the patient of the transfusion?
Well, there's two questions there. The first is it would have been the responsibility of the doctor administering or prescribing the blood, but he then delegated that responsibility for recording the transfusion, usually to the nursing staff. If it was an anaesthetist during the operation, he would usually do it. With regard to telling the patient, I don't think there was any clear formal guidance on that at the time. And the patients were told that they may need a blood transfusion, and they had samples taken, obviously prior to the operation, for that reason. And there would have been questions that they would have had to answer when the cross-match form was filled in, such as whether they'd had previous transfusion and the like. So they would have been aware that they were having a sample taken for blood transfusion. I don't know that they were told as a routine whether or not during the operation they had received transfusion. And of course, many of the transfusions would have occurred during the operative period when they were anaesthetized.
But that's not something that the haematologists would have been involved in?
No.
You've said in your statement that from the year 2000 onwards, you gradually developed a more assertive laboratory policy to question requests for transfusion components where these appeared to be inappropriate according to established guidelines.
Yeah.
First of all, why was that change introduced?
We were aware from our audits that some patients were being transfused outside our guidelines. So particularly in the post-operative period, patients were getting blood, say 1 or 2 days after the operation to bring their hemoglobin up to a certain level, which we considered unnecessary. And having agreed with that department, let's say orthopedics, that that wasn't necessary, we then audited it and found that despite the agreement, they were still doing it. So we took it upon ourselves to monitor that in real time rather than retrospectively, because however much retrospective surveys and audits you do, they don't affect what happens in real time, whereas by questioning the transfusion at the time it was ordered, we could do so. We would not question the use of blood during an operative procedure because we had no way of knowing whether that was a correct decision or not. So if the anaesthetist decides he needs to give the blood because the patient is hemodynamically unstable, we would not question that. The hemoglobin at that point is not a useful guide. Post-operatively, when the patient is hemodynamically stable, we would question it. So they would bring us up and ask us for 2 units of blood, and we would say, what is the most recent hemoglobin? Or we would look it up on the system and say, well, the most recent hemoglobin was 9 grams per deciliter. According to our guidelines, you shouldn't be using blood. And either they would say, okay, I won't have it, or they would say, but in this case I want it because, and give us a reason.
And who would be having those conversations about whether you were going to supply it or not?
Would have been the blood bank scientific staff. Some of them took to it very well, others were very nervous about questioning a medical request.
And was this arising from a national trend, or was this Newcastle specific?
This is a national trend. It was done in different ways in different hospitals, but it was very much a national trend.
And again, could it have been introduced earlier?
Yes, it could, and it will have been, changes like this occurred at different speeds in different hospitals. Yes.
What barriers were there to its earlier introduction in Newcastle?
I think the main delays to this sort of procedure are understanding. You start saying, I think we should see if we can reduce post-operative transfusion because we think it's being overused. Then you measure it. Then you decide that it's not as good as it should be. Then you speak to the department and say, well, we'd like you to do this or that. You have to then persuade them that this is the right thing to do. And we did have some who were difficult to persuade. Then you introduce a change, and then you audit it and find it doesn't work as well as you'd hoped. And then you say, well, we're going to do this, whereby we ask the blood bank staff to do it, and the blood bank staff put their hands up and say, I couldn't possibly do that. So you then have to train them, all these things take a while. If I'd spent my whole time doing blood transfusion, I might have introduced it more quickly. But we have other calls on our time, so I think it could have been done earlier. Sometimes change has to be allowed to go at its own pace. You can't always force change on people. It's a rather woolly answer, I'm afraid. But
And in terms of those colleagues who were resistant to these sorts of changes, clinician colleagues, what were their reasons for their resistance?
I think partly it was habit. Quite often it was both the nursing and the medical staff. So a consultant would have given the impression to the nursing staff, say, that after a hip operation he liked his patients to have a hemoglobin that was at such and such a level. The junior doctors would come onto the ward for a period of 3 months or so and would very much take their guidance from the senior nurses on the ward who would say, oh, well, Mr. X likes to have a well-maintained hemoglobin in his patient. He thinks it gives them a better likelihood of recovery, and so on. Those junior doctors are likely to have done what the nursing sister suggested. So very often you were trying to change the minds of people who had developed a pattern of working. It wasn't just one person, it was a whole chain of people that you were trying to affect.
I'm aware, sir, that the screens have been on and off. I'm not sure if we can look at a document at this point, or everything's still working. Wonderful. Then we'll carry on and take our break in a few moments once I've just done one more topic. I want to just look a little bit more about consent and information for patients, and then we'll take a break. Can you describe for us what patients were, first of all, told about transfusions and when they needed to have a transfusion? First of all, when you were a senior registrar, so before hepatitis C screening, do you recall what you tended to tell patients?
I don't recall clearly, but I think I would have told them that the main risk at that time was of HIV and catching it during the window period, but that we believed that that was a small risk. I think it's true to say that we were less aware of the long-term risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis, subsequently hepatitis C. So I probably wouldn't have mentioned that specifically. But I would have mentioned AIDS because that was very much in the forefront at that time.
And would you have sought express consent from a patient for a blood transfusion?
No, I wouldn't. We would talk to them and say, our patients, of course, were not anaesthetised. We would talk to them and say, I think you need a blood transfusion. I'm going to order some units of blood. If they asked any specific questions, I would have done my best to answer them. If they didn't object to it, we took that as being a form of consent.
There needed to be perhaps just 3 little words. Is that okay? Was that ever used?
I'm sure it was.
Because that would, the answer to that at any rate, if it was yes, would be express consent. It wouldn't be written consent, but it would be actual consent. Assuming that the person knew what they were consenting to.
Quite often, Sir Brian, these patients that I was dealing with personally will have been receiving blood transfusion on a regular basis. So patients who developed bone marrow failure. And most of the transfusions were part of a sequence of blood transfusions. When they were first transfused, they perhaps had a hemoglobin of 5 grams per deciliter and could barely get out of bed. At that time, they were very unlikely to refuse transfusion and were usually hugely grateful for it. I don't recall the exact form of words I would have used, but we tried to have good relations with our patients, and it's likely that with some of them I would have used words of the sort that you mentioned, but I cannot tell you exactly what I said.
Thank you.
Could we, did your practice change significantly from pre-hepatitis C screening through till the mid-90s? And then I'll pick up the change in the mid-90s.
I rather doubt it did. We became more aware of other risks of transfusion, but these were all relatively infrequent at an individual level.
And then could we look at DHSC at 304486_097, please? These are a set of minutes from the British Committee for Standards in Haematology Blood Transfusion Task Force from the 13th of July 1994. Now, I'm very aware you weren't at this meeting, but I want to explore with you whether you were aware of the discussions. If we look at the bottom of the page, we see consent for transfusion. The task force discussed the proposal at length, written comments were considered, and the following conclusions were reached. The risks associated with blood transfusion were not of such magnitude that there should be a legal requirement for informed consent to transfusion. 2, there is a clear ethical duty upon doctors to inform patient what is to be done to them, and this includes blood transfusion. The problem of transfusion given to patients under anaesthesia was particularly highlighted, and then there's a discussion about an information leaflet. Is this a discussion that you were aware of in the around 1994?
I don't recall this specific document, but I do recall having discussions in our medical staff committee in the mid-90s about whether or not we should be considering consent for blood transfusion. So it was a subject that was discussed, though whether with relation to this particular document, I'm not sure.
And at some point in the mid-90s, you've said that a specific tick box was introduced to the blood request form at the Freeman Hospital to confirm that consent had been obtained.
It was later than then. That would have been in 2011.
Oh, okay. We'll look at that in the statement. But so 2011. So then let's go back to the mid-90s when there were these discussions going on. Can you help us with what the content of those discussions were?
This is, again, dredging the memory banks, but I do recall sitting at a medical staff committee at the Freeman Hospital where probably about 50% of the consultants were present, discussing whether or not consent should be required and concluding, a bit like this document, that written consent was not required. We were, I think, in the middle of that time, introducing new consent forms, Department of Health consent forms. I'm not certain of the dates when they were introduced. They were large forms that produced a lot of discussion, which included blood transfusion as an item on for surgical consent. It usually said other medical procedures such as blood transfusion may be required. Whether that then got discussed with the patient, it was quite a long form. I cannot be certain. And
so at some point, the Freeman introduced this new tick box, a specific tick box. Why was it introduced at that point?
That was post-Sabto ruling that we should require consent. And we're aware that despite our request that all patients should be consented and it should be documented notes, this was not happening all the time. So it was introduced not because we felt it was really a true record, but it was a reminder when the doctor was filling in the request. Every time you do something like that, it reminds you, oh, I should have done that. We cannot be certain whether they then did it or not, but it was a reminder.
So that would have been after the 2011 Sabto?
It would have been, yes. I cannot give you the exact date.
That's fine. So I'm about to move on to another topic, and I wonder if now is a good time to take a break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 11:45. In this break, as in any break, please remember that you're giving evidence. During such a break, you're not allowed to talk to anyone about the answers you have given, or any answer which you think you may yet give to further questions. Anything else you can talk about?
Thank you, I understand that.
I shall see you back at 11:45.
Thank you.